The pen felt heavier than it should have. That was the first thing Lucy Wilson noticed. How something so small, so ordinary, could carry the weight of 7 years inside its ink. The notary slid the final page across the desk with the practiced indifference of someone who had witnessed the end of 100 love stories and stopped counting, and Lucy stared at the line, waiting for her signature, the way a person stares at the edge of a cliff. Not because she wanted to fall, but because falling suddenly felt like the only direction left. She signed. The sound the pen made, scratching across the paper, was quieter than she expected. She had always imagined that the moment a marriage ended, there would be something. A crack of thunder, a door slamming in the distance, the universe acknowledging in some small way that something irreversible had just happened. But there was nothing. Only the hum of the fluorescent light above her head, and the notary gathering the papers into a neat little stack, and outside the tall, narrow window, the city moving through the early evening as if it hadn't noticed that Lucy Wilson's world had just rearranged itself into something unrecognizable. She thanked the notary. She didn't know why. Old reflex. She walked out into the corridor and then through the glass doors, and then down the 3 stone steps onto the sidewalk, and then she stood very still on the pavement while the evening traffic moved around her like water around a stone, and she thought, now what? The answer, it turned out, was the apartment. Not her mother's house, not her best friend Clementine's place across town, not a hotel with crisp white sheets and a minibar, and the illusion of a fresh start. The apartment. The apartment she and Nathan had shared for 5 of their 7 years together. The one with the water stain on the kitchen ceiling that looked like a rabbit, the one where she had learned to make his mother's pasta recipe, the one where she had once been so happy that she had made a mental note of it, actually stopped in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday evening and thought, remember this. Lucy, remember exactly how this feels. She hadn't expected him to have changed the locks. She stood in front of apartment 4B with her key in her hand, and the key didn't turn. And she tried again because the mind resists the obvious when the obvious is awful. And then she understood, and she lowered her hand slowly, and she leaned her back against the door, and then she slid down it, slowly, without drama, without any real decision, until she was sitting on the corridor floor with her knees pulled to her chest and her divorce papers in her bag, and no particular plan for what happened next. The corridor was quiet. Old building quiet. The kind of quiet that comes from thick plaster walls and high ceilings and decades of lives lived softly behind closed doors. The carpet under her was the color of something that had once been burgundy. The light at the end of the hall buzzed faintly. Somewhere below, a television murmured. Lucy pressed the back of her head against the door of the life she no longer had access to, and she cried. Not dramatically. Not the way crying looks in films, where it's beautiful, and the lighting is perfect, and the tears fall in neat, photogenic lines. This was the ugly kind, the kind that comes from somewhere below language, from the part of a person that doesn't know how to be reasonable about loss. Her shoulders shook. Her breath came in stutters. She pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth because she was in a corridor and there were neighbors, and some part of her was still, even now, trying to be polite about her own devastation. She didn't hear the door across the hall open. She didn't hear the footsteps either, or rather, she heard them too late, already aware of a presence before she could compose herself, and she looked up with wet eyes and a face she knew was completely beyond saving. And she saw him. He was standing in the doorway of apartment 4C with the door open behind him, and the first thing she registered was that he was tall, genuinely unreasonably tall, the kind of tall that changes the proportions of a hallway. The second thing she registered was that he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not pity, not alarm, not the particular social discomfort of a neighbor who has accidentally witnessed something private and now needs to navigate the interaction. Something quieter than all of those things, something almost careful. He had black hair that fell past his shoulders, straight and dark as ink spilled in the dark. His features were sharp and still, the kind of face that would stop a room, and he was wearing a dark shirt with the sleeves pushed to his elbows, and his arms were folded across his chest, and he was watching her with eyes that were very dark and very calm, and Lucy, who had cried through her mascara and was sitting on a corridor floor outside a locked door that used to be hers, thought distantly that this was perhaps the most humiliating moment of her adult life.
"I live here," she said, and her voice came out broken and absurd because she had been crying, and also because the sentence wasn't even true anymore.
He looked at the door behind her, then back at her.
You used to.
It wasn't unkind. It wasn't particularly kind either. It was just accurate. And something about the precision of it, the refusal to pretend, made her laugh. A short, wet, hiccuping thing that surprised her almost as much as it seemed to surprise him. His expression shifted fractionally. Not a smile, something adjacent to one.
"I just signed my divorce papers," she said, because apparently she had decided that dignity was no longer an option for this evening, and she might as well commit to the honesty. He changed the locks. I didn't have anywhere else to go yet. I'm sorry. I'll move."
She started to push herself up from the floor, which was harder than it should have been because her legs had gone slightly numb and her hands were shaking, and she was halfway up when he spoke again.
You don't have to.
She looked at him.
Move.
He clarified. His voice was low and even, with a cadence that didn't quite match the city. Something older in it, something that had no urgency in it at all, as if he had never once in his life been in a hurry.
If you need to sit somewhere that isn't a hallway floor.
Lucy looked at the open door behind him, then at him, then at the divorce papers inside her bag, which she was aware of the way you're aware of a bruise. Constantly, dully, at the edge of everything.
"I don't even know you?"
she said. Which was true. She had lived across this hallway for 3 years, and she had seen him. Glimpses, really, a dark shape in the corridor at odd hours, a quiet neighbor who left no noise and received no visitors, but she had never spoken to him. Nathan had called him strange. She had called him private. It had been one of their arguments once, the small and stupid kind, her defending a man she'd never met because Nathan had decided he was suspicious for the crime of being quiet.
No.
The man across the hall agreed, with the tone of someone who found this entirely reasonable.
You don't.
And then he simply stepped back from the door, leaving it open, and walked back into his apartment, not waiting for her answer, not pressing, not performing hospitality, just offering and withdrawing and leaving the decision entirely to her. Lucy stood in the corridor for a moment with her bag on her shoulder and her key still in her hand and her life freshly dismantled around her, and she thought about Clementine, who would make tea and ask too many questions and look at her with that particular expression of someone constructing their opinion of Nathan in real time. And she thought about her mother, who would say, "I told you so," without saying it, who would say it with every careful word she chose not to say. And she thought about a hotel room with anonymous walls and the specific loneliness of clean, impersonal sheets. She walked across the hall and through the open door. The apartment was not what she expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected, exactly. Something sparse, perhaps, or cold, or the interior of a person who valued privacy above all else. But what she found was a space that felt lived in, deeply and strangely, the way a library feels lived in. There were books everywhere, on shelves that covered entire walls, in stacks on the floor beside chairs, on the windowsill between dark curtains that were almost entirely drawn. The furniture was old and good, not antique in the precious sense, but old in the way that things get old when someone has actually used them across many years. A sofa that had been expensive once and had aged into something better than expensive. A reading lamp with a warm amber bulb. A low table with a half-empty glass of something dark on it. The city showed through the gap in the curtains, just a narrow band of it. The lit windows of the building across the street, the particular purple gray of an evening sky in a city that never got truly dark.
You have a lot of books.
Lucy said, because she had to say something, and the books were the most honest thing in the room.
I've had time to collect them.
He had moved to the kitchen, a small galley off the main room, and she heard the quiet sounds of something being prepared. She stood just inside the door, still holding her bag, and looked at his shelves. The titles were in several languages, some of which she didn't recognize. The spines were cracked and familiar in the way that only books that have actually been read look familiar. She set her bag down on the floor beside the sofa because her shoulder ached and because some part of her had already decided to stay for a few minutes, and she sat on the edge of the cushion and looked at the narrow band of city through the curtains, and she breathed. It was quiet in here, genuinely quiet in a way her life hadn't been in years. Not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of stillness, the kind that doesn't demand anything from you. He came back with 2 cups of something that turned out to be tea, plain, dark, no ceremony, and set one in front of her on the low table and sat in the chair across from her with his own cup, and he didn't say anything at all, which was perhaps the kindest thing anyone had done for her all day.
I'm Lucy,
she said after a while.
I know.
She looked at him.
Your mail occasionally ends up in my box. Building sorting system is...
He paused, choosing the word with the consideration of someone who has strong opinions about language.
Optimistic.
Lucy almost smiled. It felt strange on her face, like a word she'd forgotten how to pronounce.
And you are?
Marlon.
He said it simply. Nothing appended. No last name offered, no social scaffolding, no performing of the ritual of introduction. Just the name, clean and complete. Lucy looked at him across the low table, this strange and quiet neighbor with his walls of books and his old furniture, and his face that seemed like it had been carved by someone who had very specific ideas about what a face should look like. And she thought, he doesn't feel like someone who has anything to prove to anyone. She couldn't remember the last time she had met a person like that.
He said I was too much,
she said, and she hadn't planned to say it. It came out the way things come out when you are very tired, and your defenses have been running at full capacity for months, and they have simply run out of power.
Nathan, my ex-husband. He said I was too intense, too emotional, that I wanted too much from everything, from him, from us.
Marlon looked at her. He was very still, the way certain things are still. Not the stillness of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but the stillness of someone who is actually listening, which is a different and rarer thing. He didn't say, "You're not too much." He didn't say, "He didn't deserve you." He didn't say any of the things that people say when they want to comfort someone and also want credit for having comforted them. He said,
So people who cannot hold intensity often mistake it for a flaw in the thing they're holding.
Lucy stared at him. It was such a strange and precise thing to say. It landed somewhere underneath her sternum and pressed gently, like a hand on a bruise. Not cruel, but honest. She felt her eyes go hot again, which she had not intended, and she looked down at the tea in her hands and breathed through it.
Don't abandon me like he did,
she said. And her voice broke on the last word, and she heard herself saying it and felt immediately absurd, because she didn't know this man. She didn't know this man at all, and the sentence had come from somewhere so far below reason that it embarrassed her, even as it was leaving her mouth. Marlon didn't look embarrassed. He didn't look uncomfortable. He looked at her with those very dark, very calm eyes, and something moved through them that she couldn't name. Something old, she thought irrationally, something that had been sad for a very long time and had learned to carry it. He reached across the table, and with one hand, careful, deliberate, asking nothing, he pressed his thumb to her cheek and wiped the tear there.
I don't abandon people,
he said. And somehow, sitting in the apartment of a man she didn't know, with her divorce papers in her bag and her old life locked behind a door across the hall, Lucy Wilson believed him. She would think about this moment later. She would think about how easily she had believed him, and whether that was grief-talking or instinct, or something else entirely, some small and stubborn part of her that had always been able to tell when a person meant what they said. She would think about it later. For now, she wrapped both hands around the tea he had made her, and she sat in his quiet apartment with his walls of books around her, like a held breath. And outside the narrow gap in the curtains, the city turned slowly toward night. And Marlon Zhang, who had been alive for 230 years and had watched more sunsets than he could count, and had learned, across centuries, not to want things too specifically. Marlon Zhang sat across from her and watched her hold the tea and breathe, and felt something move inside him that he had not felt in a very long time. Something that felt, against all reason, like the beginning of something. She woke up on a sofa that wasn't hers, under a blanket that smelled like old paper and something darker underneath. Cedar, maybe, or something she didn't have a name for. And for exactly 3 seconds, she didn't remember anything. Then she did. Lucy lay still for a moment with the blanket pulled to her chin and the amber light of the reading lamp still on across the room. She must have fallen asleep with it burning, sometime between her second cup of tea and whatever half-formed sentence she'd been saying when consciousness quietly excused itself. And she listened to the apartment. It was early. The particular quality of the silence said early. The city outside the curtains still carrying that held-breath quality of a place not yet fully awake. The light behind the dark fabric, thin and gray and new. She sat up slowly. The blanket was folded over her, with a precision that suggested someone had done it deliberately, carefully, after she was already asleep. She looked at the chair across the low table where Marlon had been sitting, and it was empty, and the cup he'd been holding was gone, and for a disorienting moment she had the feeling of having imagined the whole previous evening. The notary's desk, the key that didn't turn, the corridor floor, the man in the doorway, with his walls of books, and his careful voice, and his thumb against her cheek, wiping a tear she hadn't been able to stop. But the blanket was real. And the apartment was real. And from the direction of the kitchen came a sound. Lucy set the blanket aside and stood, and padded toward the kitchen in her socked feet. She had taken her shoes off at some point. She didn't quite remember when, and she stopped in the doorway. Marlon was standing at the counter with his back to her. He had changed from the night before. Darker shirt now, same pushed-up sleeves, and he was doing something at the counter with a concentration that seemed, she thought, slightly excessive for whatever the task actually was. There was a pan on the stove. There was bread in the toaster. There was, inexplicably, a small bunch of flowers in a glass of water on the windowsill, which she was almost certain had not been there last night. He hadn't heard her. Or, she would think about this later, he had heard her and chose the moment he revealed it carefully, because a few seconds after she appeared in the doorway, he set down what he was holding and turned, and his expression did the thing it had done the night before. Not quite settling, not quite arriving at anything as legible as an emotion, but moving through the neighborhood of one.
You're awake.
He said it with the tone of someone confirming a fact they had already known.
I'm awake.
Lucy agreed. She looked at the stove, at the pan, at the bread in the toaster, at the flowers.
Are you making breakfast?
Attempting?
He said, and turned back to the counter, which she was beginning to understand was a thing he did. Turned away at precise moments, as if calibrating how much of himself to show at any given time. Lucy leaned her shoulder against the doorframe and watched him. He moved through the kitchen with a kind of fluid efficiency that she associated with people who have done physical things for a very long time. No wasted motion, no uncertainty about where things were, no consulting the pan to check whether it was hot enough. He simply knew. He cracked 2 eggs into the pan with one hand in a single clean motion, and Lucy, who had made breakfast for 2 people for 5 years and still occasionally got shell in the eggs, watched this with a respect she didn't announce.
You don't have to do this,
she said.
I'm aware.
There's probably a coffee shop open by now. I could go and.
Sit down, Lucy.
It wasn't an order. It was something quieter than an order. A sentence that simply expected to be obeyed, the way gravity expects things, without raising its voice about it. Lucy sat down at the small table against the kitchen wall, which had 2 chairs and a surface just wide enough for 2 plates, and which had the look of a table that had not had 2 people sitting at it in a very long time. He plated the eggs. He put toast on the side. He set a cup of coffee in front of her, black, because he hadn't asked how she took it, and she didn't think he was the kind of person who guessed at things like sugar. And he set a glass of orange juice beside that, and then he set her plate in front of her, with the quiet authority of someone who has decided that a person needs to eat, and has made it their business to ensure it happens. Then he sat down across from her. With no plate, Lucy looked at the table. She looked at him. She looked at the table again.
You're not eating.
I ate earlier.
She picked up her fork. The eggs were perfect. She could tell before she tasted them. The edges just crisp, the yolk still soft, seasoned exactly right. And she hated a little bit that she noticed this, because it made the whole situation more confusing rather than less.
What did you eat?
A pause. Very small. The kind of pause that a person who is not paying attention would miss entirely.
Something light.
She checked her phone, which she had somehow not lost through the entire catastrophe of the previous evening.
6:15 in the morning.
I'm an early riser.
Lucy ate a bite of toast. It was good toast. Everything he had made was good, with the infuriating confidence of someone who either genuinely loved cooking or had been practicing for an unreasonable amount of time. She looked at him across the small table. He was sitting with his forearms resting on the surface, his hands loose, and he was watching her eat with an expression that was attentive without being intrusive. The way someone watches a thing they find genuinely interesting but have decided not to comment on. In the morning light, thin as it was, coming through the gap in the kitchen curtain, she could see his face more clearly than she had the night before. The sharp lines of it, the strong jaw, the dark eyes that caught the light in a way she couldn't quite account for. The long black hair loose around his shoulders. He was, she thought, with the detached clarity of someone cataloging a fact rather than responding to it, extraordinarily beautiful. In the way that certain things were beautiful that weren't trying to be. Old buildings, dark water, the particular geometry of a face that had been built without vanity.
How long have you lived here?
She asked.
In this apartment, 11 years.
And before this?
Various places.
That's not an answer.
No.
He agreed pleasantly. Lucy ate more of her eggs because they were excellent and because she needed something to do with her hands while she navigated whatever this conversation was.
You have books in at least 4 languages on those shelves.
5.
Do you speak all of them?
And a few others.
She set her fork down.
Marlon.
Lucy.
That's also not an answer.
You haven't asked a question yet. You've made observations. I've confirmed them. That's a different kind of conversation.
She stared at him. He looked back at her with those dark, steady eyes and the bare suggestion of something that might, on a different face, have been amusement. A quality so restrained it was almost theoretical, a humor that existed in the architecture of a sentence rather than in any expression.
Fine. Question, why aren't you eating?
I told you.
You told me something that wasn't true. Question, are you going to tell me the true thing?
The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the city was waking up. She could hear it distantly, the first buses, the particular rhythm of a place returning to itself. But in here, the quiet held, specific and contained, like the quiet inside a room where someone is deciding something. Marlon looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and picked up her coffee cup, hers, the one she had been drinking from, and turned it slowly in his hands and set it back down in front of her. And the gesture was so strange and deliberate that she almost missed what it meant, a deflection so elegant it was almost an art form.
Eat your breakfast,
He said.
You're very good at not answering things.
I've had practice.
How much practice?
More than you'd expect.
She looked at him. He looked back. She picked up her fork because the eggs were going cold, and also because she didn't know what else to do. And she ate, and he watched, and the kitchen held them both in its small, specific quiet. It was when she reached across the table for the orange juice that she saw it. She hadn't meant to look. Her eyes simply went there, the way eyes go to things that don't quite fit, drawn by some instinct below conscious thought. And what she saw was his forearm, bare below the pushed-up sleeve and along the inside of it, running from just below the elbow toward the wrist, a scar. Old, she could tell, not the sharp, clean line of something recent, but the softened, settled look of something that had been there a very long time. Too long, something in her said, for the age that his face suggested. She didn't mean to reach for it. Her fingers were already touching the scar before she'd made the decision, her fingertips brushing the slightly raised skin of it, not grabbing, just touching, the way you touch something you're trying to understand. And she felt him go very still, under her hand. Not tense. Still, the way water goes still, right before something breaks the surface.
Where did this come from?
His forearm didn't move. He didn't pull away. He looked down at her hand on his arm, and something passed through his face. Not pain, not quite, but something adjacent to it. Something that had been pain once and had calcified into memory.
A long time ago.
He said.
How long?
He raised his eyes to hers. And in the thin morning light of the kitchen, with her fingers still resting against the scar on his arm, Lucy had the sudden and irrational and absolutely certain feeling that the answer to that question was not a number she was prepared for. He didn't give her the number. What he did was turn his arm slightly, not pulling away, but shifting. And his hand came to rest over hers, very lightly, his fingers curling just enough to hold without trapping, and he looked at her with those dark eyes that had the quality of depth without showing the bottom.
You ask a great many questions for someone who slept through most of them last night.
She laughed. Again, it surprised her. The short, unguarded thing, arriving before she could decide whether to let it. He watched it happen with that almost expression, the one that lived in the vicinity of warmth.
I was tired. I had a whole marriage end yesterday.
You did.
And you let a crying stranger sleep on your sofa.
You weren't a stranger. Your mail comes to my box.
That's a very low bar for non-stranger status.
Perhaps I have flexible criteria.
She shook her head slowly, still smiling, and he was still holding her hand lightly on his arm, and she was still sitting at his table, eating the perfect eggs he had made for her, while he had nothing at all, and she thought, I should find all of this much stranger than I do. The thought arrived and departed without urgency. She filed it somewhere. Later, she would understand that this was one of his gifts, making the inexplicable feel habitable, making the strange feel like something a person could sit with over breakfast in a small kitchen with thin morning light coming through a curtain gap, and that it was not a trick, not manipulation, but something genuine in him, a quality built from centuries of learning how to exist in a world that didn't know what he was. She didn't know that yet. What she knew was that his hand was warm over hers, warmer than she expected, which she noted and set aside, and that the apartment was quiet in a way that suited her, and that for the first time in longer than she could immediately calculate, she did not feel like she was too much for the space she was sitting in. She finished her eggs. He watched her finish them with the attention of someone who finds genuine satisfaction in a person being fed, which was either very domestic or very strange, and possibly both.
I should go,
she said, eventually. The practical world was reasserting itself. She had a phone with notifications she hadn't looked at, a bag with divorce papers in it, a friend who didn't know where she was, a life that needed reorganizing from the ground up.
Yes.
Thank you for all of this, the sofa, the blanket, the very good eggs.
The eggs were straightforward.
The blanket wasn't.
He looked at her. She looked at him. Something passed between them in the kitchen quiet. Not a declaration, Nothing so legible as that, but an acknowledgement. The kind that happens below words. In the part of human interaction, that language was invented to approximate and never quite managed to reach. She stood and gathered herself, and he walked her to the door. And she picked up her bag from beside the sofa and felt the weight of the papers inside it, and felt that weight differently than she had the night before. Still real, still present, but somehow less like the end of something, and more like a cleared space, a room emptied out so that something else could eventually move in. At the door, she turned.
The flowers.
She said.
What about them?
On the windowsill. They weren't there last night.
A beat.
No.
You went out this morning, before I woke up, before 6:15.
I told you I was an early riser.
You bought flowers.
He said nothing. He stood in his own doorway, with his arms loosely at his sides and his dark eyes entirely calm, and he did not confirm or deny, which was itself a confirmation of a kind. Lucy looked at him for a moment. This strange, quiet, beautiful man, with his 5 languages and his walls of books, and his scar that was too old, and his breakfast he didn't eat. And she thought, I am going to need to know who you are.
I'll see you, Marlon.
Yes.
He said, with the certainty of someone who was not making a social nicety, but stating a fact.
You will.
She crossed the hall. Her old key was still in her bag. Useless now, a small metal artifact of a life that had been locked against her, but she had her phone, and Clementine's number, and the address of a woman she used to be, who was currently in the process of becoming someone she didn't recognize yet. She pressed the elevator button. Behind her, she heard his door close. Softly, with the deliberate quiet of a person who has learned, across a very long time, not to make unnecessary noise in the world. In the elevator, going down, Lucy Wilson looked at her own reflection in the mirrored door and thought about warm hands and old scars and flowers that appeared on windowsills before the sun was properly up, and she thought about the way he had said you will, with the calm certainty of someone who simply knew things, and she pressed her fingers to her cheek where his thumb had been the night before. And she felt, underneath the grief and the exhaustion and the freshly signed wreckage of her marriage, something she didn't have a name for yet. Something that had, very quietly, already begun. The restaurant had been Nathan's idea, which should have been her first warning. Nathan always chose the restaurant. In 7 years of marriage, he had chosen every restaurant, every table, every occasion, with the quiet authority of someone who had decided early on that his taste was the reliable one, and had never been seriously challenged on this point. Lucy had let him, mostly, because it hadn't seemed worth the argument, and because she had spent the better part of their marriage learning which things were worth the argument and which things were the hill she did not need to die on today, and restaurant selection had always fallen firmly into the second category. She understood now, sitting in the taxi going home, that this was the problem, not the restaurants. The restaurants were fine. The problem was that she had spent 7 years sorting her own preferences into categories of worth it and not worth it, and the not worth it pile had gotten so large that she had eventually lost track of what was in it, and somewhere underneath all those concessions was a version of herself she hadn't consulted in a very long time. Nathan had looked good. This was the other thing that was making her angry. In the taxi, watching the city slide past the window, he had looked good, rested, untroubled, wearing the blue jacket she had bought him for his birthday 2 years ago, and he had ordered the salmon and a glass of white wine, and he had said, with the measured reasonableness of someone who had clearly rehearsed this, that he hoped they could be adults about the apartment situation. The apartment situation. 7 years. A rabbit-shaped water stain on the kitchen ceiling. A pasta recipe learned from his mother. A key she still hadn't managed to throw away. And what they had left, according to Nathan over salmon and white wine, was a situation. She had been, she thought now, extremely calm. She had been calm the way a pressure cooker is calm. All the heat contained, nothing visible on the surface, just a very slight and constant vibration that a careful observer might notice. She had said the appropriate things. She had not thrown anything. She had signed the check because he had forgotten his wallet, which she only recognized as a final absurdity when she was already outside on the pavement. The taxi pulled up to the building, and she paid and got out and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing the night air, which was cool and carried the particular smell of a city in early autumn, exhaust and something green underneath it, the ghost of a season changing. And she thought, I need to go upstairs, and I need to not cry about Nathan again, because I have cried enough about Nathan to last a reasonable person several lifetimes, and I need to... The lobby door opened. Marlon came out. He was wearing a dark coat she hadn't seen before, long, the kind of coat that belongs to a certain type of person. Not fashionable exactly, but with the authority of something chosen with complete conviction. He had his hands in his pockets, and he was moving with that particular quality of his, that unhurried certainty. And he stopped when he saw her on the sidewalk, and he looked at her face, and something in his expression adjusted, almost imperceptibly, but she was beginning to learn to read the small calibrations of him.
You're back late.
It was an observation, not a question. She was beginning to understand the difference with him.
I had dinner with my ex-husband,
she said, and her voice came out with an edge she hadn't entirely planned.
He called it a conversation about the apartment situation. I called it 45 minutes of being spoken to like a moderately inconvenient administrative problem.
Marlon looked at her. In the amber light of the building's entrance, his eyes were very dark and very steady.
Did you eat?
Yes, I ate. That's not...
Good.
Marlon, that is genuinely not the point.
I know it's not the point. I'm noting it anyway.
She stared at him. And then, against her will, against all the momentum of the anger she had been carefully tending in the back of the taxi all the way home, she felt something shift. Not dissolve. The anger was still there, still real, still hers, but it moved, made space, rearranged itself around something else. She looked at him standing on the pavement outside their building in his long, dark coat, asking if she'd eaten with the straightforward priority of someone for whom this was simply the most important question. And she thought, when was the last time someone asked me that first?
Where are you going?
Nowhere urgent. I walk at night.
Every night?
Most.
Alone?
Usually.
She looked at the street. The city, at this hour, had a different quality. Quieter, more honest. The performance of daytime stripped away, and what was left was something more skeletal and more true. She had always liked cities at night. Nathan had not. Another item for the not-worth-it pile, she supposed. All those nights she had wanted to walk and stayed in instead.
Can I come?
He looked at her for a moment. That unhurried assessment, reading something in her face that she suspected was more legible to him than she was comfortable with.
You're angry.
I'm furious.
Good.
She blinked.
Good?
Better than what you were 2 nights ago.
He turned and walked, and she fell into step beside him, and they went out into the night city together without further negotiation. She didn't know where he walked. She didn't ask. He moved through the streets with the ease of someone who knows a city in the way that only comes from very long familiarity. Not the familiarity of maps or habit, but something deeper. The knowledge of a place that has changed around you over time. The way you know the shape of something by having watched it become itself. He took turns she wouldn't have chosen, and she found herself in parts of the city she'd walked past, but never through. Quieter streets with older buildings, the kind of architecture that survives because it was built to outlast the people who built it. She talked. She hadn't planned to. She had planned, vaguely, to walk in the good silence she had noticed he was capable of. But the night and the movement and the anger still running warm through her loosened something, and she talked about Nathan, and then about the marriage, and then about the version of herself she had become inside it. The one who sorted everything into worth it and not worth it, and had lost track of the pile. Marlon walked beside her and listened, not with the effortful attention of someone performing listening, not the nodding and the humming and the careful expressions, but with a quality of stillness that made her feel heard in the way that silence can sometimes make you feel heard better than words. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer counterpoints or comfort or the particular kind of reframing that people offer when they want you to feel better quickly so the conversation can be over. He just walked beside her and let her be angry. And she found, moving through the night city with him, that being allowed to be angry was its own kind of relief. Eventually, the words ran out. They walked in silence for a while, and it was the good kind, the inhabited kind, and the city moved around them, and above them the sky was the particular deep blue of a night with too much light in it to be truly dark.
He said I wanted too much,
she said eventually, coming back to it. The original wound, the one underneath all the others.
Nathan. He said it at the end, and he'd said it before, but at the end he said it like it was a diagnosis. Like wanting things was a character flaw I should have disclosed before the wedding.
What did you want?
She looked at him as they walked.
Everything. I wanted the real version of everything. The real conversations, the real fights, I didn't want it to be managed. I didn't want to be handled. I wanted someone who would just be in it with me all the way in, not standing at the edge deciding how much to feel.
Marlon was quiet for a moment. They had turned, without her noticing, back toward the building. She could see it at the end of the block, the lit lobby through the glass.
That isn't too much,
he said.
Everyone I've known has thought so.
You've known the wrong people.
She stopped walking. He went 2 steps further before he stopped too, and turned and looked at her on the pavement with the night behind her and the amber light catching the angles of her face, and his expression was the most open she had seen it, still not fully legible, still carrying that quality of depth that didn't show the bottom, but something in it was present in a way that it hadn't been before. Something that wasn't performing calm because it had to, but was simply, genuinely here.
Marlon.
Lucy.
I need to ask you something.
You need to ask me several things. You've been not asking them since this morning.
Then come upstairs and let me ask them.
He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked to the building and held the door, and she walked through it. They went up in the elevator in silence. He opened his apartment with the ease of long familiarity, and she went in ahead of him, and this time she didn't hesitate at the door, didn't look around like a stranger taking inventory. She went to the sofa and sat down and pulled her feet up under her, and he sat in the chair across from her. But this time, she noticed it immediately, not quite as far. The chair was closer to the sofa than it had been, not dramatically, just a few inches, enough to feel. She looked at his shelves, at the books in their 5 languages, at the painting on the wall she had half noticed before. Dark oils, European, very old, a landscape with figures in the distance, and at the photograph on the side table she had not looked at closely before, which she looked at now. It was black and white, old enough that the contrast was high and the tones were deep, the way photographs were before they learned to make them look like life. 2 men standing in front of a building she didn't recognize. One of them was a stranger. The other had long black hair and sharp features and a jawline she would know in any century. She looked at him. He looked back.
That's you,
she said, not a question.
Yes.
It's a very old photograph.
Yes.
How old?
A pause. The apartment was very quiet. The city outside the curtains had settled into its deep night mode, the sounds of it low and distant, like something heard through water.
1891.
Lucy looked at the photograph, then at him, then at the photograph again. The mind, she was discovering, has a way of processing impossible things that involves a brief and almost comic delay, a moment where the information arrives and the brain simply holds it, turning it over, checking it against everything it knows about the world, and finding that it doesn't fit, and then slowly beginning to rebuild the map.
You're not 30.
No.
You look 30.
I know.
How old are you?
230.
He said, with the even tone of someone stating their age at a doctor's office.
Said approximately. The records from the early years are imprecise.
Lucy sat with this. The clock on his wall, old, pendulum, the kind that measures time with a seriousness that digital things never manage, ticked slowly in the silence.
Are you going to tell me what you are, or are you going to make me say it?
I think you should say it,
He said.
So I sound insane.
so it's real to you. There's a difference.
She looked at him, at the darkness of his eyes in the lamplight, at the absolute stillness of him. The kind of stillness she had noticed from the first night and had attributed to personality, and now understood, was something else entirely. The stillness of a thing that has no heartbeat to betray it, no metabolic hum of ordinary life.
Vampire.
She said. The words sat in the room between them. He didn't flinch. He didn't smile. He held her gaze with that deep, dark steadiness and said nothing, and the nothing was confirmation enough.
The breakfast.
She said, because her mind, apparently, in the absence of screaming or running, had decided to audit the evidence.
You didn't eat. You made everything for me, and you didn't.
I can eat human food. It doesn't
He paused.
sustain me, but I can eat it.
You just chose not to.
It seemed beside the point. You needed to eat. I needed to watch you not be in a corridor floor.
Lucy was quiet. Something was happening inside her that she didn't have a clean word for. Not fear, though fear was there, small and reasonable and appropriate in the circumstances. Not disbelief, because the photograph was on the table, and the scar was on his arm, and 2 centuries sat in the cadence of his voice like sediment in deep water. Something more complex than either. Something that felt, distantly, like the sensation of a room coming into focus, like having been squinting for a long time without knowing it, and suddenly, involuntarily, seeing clearly.
The warmth.
She said.
Your hands. When you held my hand this morning, you were warm.
I'm not what the stories say. Most of it is mythology, accumulated fiction, centuries of rumor.
But some of it is true.
Some.
Which parts?
He looked at her for a long moment, and then he stood, and he moved. And she felt it before she saw it. A change in the air, a quality of motion that was not quite the way humans move. Too smooth, too certain, the way water moves rather than the way people do. And he was standing at the window, and he pulled the curtain aside, and she could see his profile against the dark city outside, and the city looked very small behind him.
I don't age. I don't die by ordinary means. I'm stronger than I look, and I look strong. I see better in the dark than in the light. I've watched this city change for over a century, and I will watch it change for centuries more.
He turned from the window, and across the room, in the amber light, his eyes were darker than they had been a moment ago, and there was something in them that was very old and very alone, and Lucy looked at it and felt something move in her chest.
And I have been,
He said quietly.
let alone for a very long time.
The apartment held them both in its quiet. The clock ticked. The city murmured outside the glass. And Lucy, who had come home tonight with a belly full of Nathan's salmon and a heart full of managed grievances, and the specific exhaustion of being made to feel like too much, looked at this man who had been alive for 230 years and had walked alone through every one of them, and felt the absurd and overwhelming and entirely illogical desire to close the distance between them. She didn't. Not yet, but she uncurled from the sofa and she crossed the room, and she stood beside him at the window, and they looked out at the city together, the lit windows, the moving lights below, all those lives happening simultaneously, all those people inside, all those frames of yellow light. And she was close enough to feel the particular stillness of him, the absence of the small unconscious sounds that human bodies make just by existing.
230 years.
She said.
Give or take.
That's a long time to be alone.
Yes.
Is that why you let me in, 2 nights ago? A crying stranger with divorce papers.
He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant he was choosing the true answer rather than the easy one.
I let you in.
He said.
Because the moment I saw you in that corridor, something in me recognized something in you. And I have been alive long enough to know that that doesn't happen often, and to know better than to close the door on it when it does.
Lucy looked at his profile, the sharp geometry of it against the city light. 230 years of solitude in the lines of it, in the patience of it, in the way he looked at the world as if he had learned, across centuries, to want things very carefully, because wanting things carelessly had cost him more than she could calculate. She reached out and put her hand over his, where it rested on the window frame. He looked down at her hand, then at her. And the thing that moved through his face then was not restrained or calibrated or careful. It was simply there, present and undefended, and it was the most human thing she had seen from him, and it was also somehow the least human, because no human being had ever looked at her with that particular quality of recognition, as if she were something he had been looking for across 2 centuries, without knowing the shape of what he was looking for.
You should have told me sooner,
she said.
You needed a neighbor before you needed the truth.
And now?
Now,
He said, turning his hand under hers until their palms met.
you need both.
Outside, the city turned in its slow, nocturnal rotation, indifferent and luminous. Inside, in the quiet of apartment 4C, with its walls of books and its pendulum clock and its photograph from 1891, Lucy Wilson stood at the window with her hand in the hand of a man who had been alone since before her great-grandmother was born, and she felt the ground shifting under her life, not collapsing, not crumbling, but moving, the way the ground moves when something new is being built underneath it. She didn't leave that night until almost 3 in the morning. And when she crossed the hall to her new apartment, she had a new apartment now, smaller, 1 floor up, a place that was entirely hers in a way that nothing had been in 7 years. She stood inside her own door in the dark and pressed her back against it and breathed, and felt the shape of what was happening settle around her like something that had been coming for a long time and had simply, finally, arrived. Across the hall and 1 floor down, she knew Marlon Zhang was standing at his window, looking at the city he had watched for over a century, and she knew, without being told, that he was thinking about her hand in his. She was thinking about it too. It had become, without either of them formally deciding it, a kind of routine. Not the performed kind, not the routine of 2 people who have agreed to be in each other's lives and are now executing the agreement, but the organic kind, the kind that grows up quietly between people who keep finding themselves in the same place at the same time and eventually stop pretending it's coincidence. Lucy had her own apartment now, 1 floor up, a small place with good light in the mornings and a kitchen she was slowly learning to cook in again, and she slept in it most nights, and most evenings she was in apartment 4C. She had a key. He had given it to her 2 weeks ago without ceremony, set it on the table beside her coffee cup one morning, and said nothing about it, and she had picked it up and put it in her pocket, and they had continued the conversation they were having about a book she'd found on his shelf, and neither of them had commented on what had just happened, because commenting on it would have made it smaller than it was. She used the key now, letting herself in while he was out. He had texted, which she still found mildly astonishing, that he had something to attend to and would be back by 9. And she dropped her bag on the sofa and her jacket on the hook by the door that had become, without negotiation, her hook, and she went to the kitchen to make tea. She was standing at the stove when someone knocked on the door. Not her door, his. She stood still for a moment, the kettle in her hand, listening. The knock came again, 3 times, measured, with the cadence of someone who was not uncertain about knocking, who had knocked on many doors across many years and had developed an opinion about the correct way to do it. She set the kettle down and went to the door and opened it. The man in the corridor was tall, not as tall as Marlon, but tall enough, with pale blonde hair swept back from a face that was the kind of handsome that belonged to another era, the aristocratic geometry of cheekbones and a jaw that would have looked at home in an oil portrait. He was wearing a dark suit with the ease of someone who had been wearing suits since before suits were called that, and his eyes were a light gray that caught the corridor light in a way that told her, before anything else, what he was. He looked at her. Something moved through his expression. Surprise, quickly managed, and then something more careful, more considered. He smiled. It was a beautiful smile, and she did not entirely trust it.
"You must be Lucy,"
he said, and his voice had an accent she couldn't place. Something European, old world, the vowels shaped by a language that wasn't English first.
I must be.
She said.
And you are?
He tilted his head fractionally, as if her directness was a thing he was calibrating to.
"Alaric St. James, an old friend of Marlon's."
How old?
His smile didn't widen, exactly, but it deepened. Became something more genuine, as if she had said something that revised his assessment of her upward.
"Older than this building. Older than this city, in its current form."
He's not here right now.
"I know. I didn't come to see him first."
The corridor was quiet between them. Lucy looked at this man, this old, dangerous, elegant thing in a dark suit, and thought about the 17 different reasons why she should close the door, and thought about the kettle on the stove, and thought about 230 years of Marlon's life that she hadn't been present for. All those decades and centuries that existed before her like rooms she hadn't been given access to yet. She stepped back from the door. He came in. He moved through Marlon's apartment the way someone moves through a place they know well but haven't visited in some time, with the proprietary ease of familiarity and the slight adjustment of someone recalibrating to changes. He looked at the shelves. At the photograph from 1891. He picked it up and looked at it for a moment and set it back down with a care that was either respect or something more complicated.
"He's kept this place exactly the same,"
he said.
Is that unusual?
For Marlon? No. He finds something he trusts and he keeps it."
She brought the tea through. 2 cups, because whatever this was, she was going to face it with something warm in her hands. And she sat on the sofa, and he sat in the chair across from her, which was Marlon's chair, and she noticed that he sat in it without asking, and she noticed that she minded. And she noticed that minding told her something about how she thought of this apartment and the person it belonged to. Alaric looked at her over the tea he didn't touch.
"You know what he is,
Yes.
and you're still here.
Evidently.
Most people aren't. Still here, after they know."
I'm not most people.
He looked at her with those gray eyes, and she had the unsettling sensation of being read. Not the way Marlon read her, which felt like being understood, but the way a document is read, assessed for content and reliability.
"No,
He said after a moment.
I don't think you are."
He set the untouched cup down on the table and leaned back in the chair and crossed one leg over the other and looked at her with the settled patience of a person who has no urgency about anything because time has long since stopped being a resource he could run out of.
"He had someone before, a human woman. This was a long time ago. Before I knew him well, but I knew him well enough afterward to understand what it did to him."
Lucy was quiet. The kettle had finished boiling at some point, and the apartment was very still. And outside the window, the city moved through its early evening routines, indifferent and continuous.
What was her name?
He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not warmth, exactly, but a kind of acknowledgement.
"Aunt May, she was remarkable. The kind of person who makes the world feel more inhabited just by being in it."
He paused. The clock on the wall ticked its slow, deliberate rhythm.
"She died, as humans do. And Marlon, he didn't recover from it the way people say you recover from things." He continued. "That's different. He continued for 140 years, and he was careful, after that, not to want anything too specifically. Not to let anything become necessary."
Lucy looked at the photograph on the side table. The man in it, her neighbor, her strange and careful and ancient neighbor, standing in front of a building in 1891 with a face she knew and a history she was only beginning to understand the shape of.
Why are you telling me this?
"Because you should know what you're walking into. Not to frighten you. Because you deserve the full picture before you go further. And because Marlon,
He stopped, chose his words with the deliberateness of someone who chooses them carefully.
So Marlon will not tell you himself. Not because he wants to hide it. Because he has spent 140 years not talking about it. And that kind of silence becomes structural. You can't just open a door that's been sealed that long without the whole wall moving.
So you came to open it for him?
I came,
Alaric said.
to make sure that whoever was on the other side of it was worth the wall moving.
The front door opened. The change in the room was immediate. Not dramatic, nothing as legible as tension or confrontation, but a shift in the quality of the air, the way the air shifts when a storm front changes direction. Marlon stood in the doorway in his dark coat, and he saw Alaric in his chair, and he saw Lucy on his sofa, and his face did something she had never seen it do before. It went very still, stiller than his usual stillness. The stillness of something that has been surprised and is not accustomed to being surprised and does not enjoy it.
Alaric.
His voice was even, entirely even, the kind of even that is not natural but chosen.
You're in my apartment. Sitting in my chair. Talking to...
He stopped, looked at Lucy, and the thing that moved through his face in that half-second, the thing that happened when his eyes found her, sitting composed on his sofa with her tea and her straight spine, and her expression that was watchful but not afraid, was not anger and not relief, but something that had no clean name, something that looked like a man realizing, with the full weight of 2 centuries behind the realization, exactly how much someone has come to matter to him. Alaric rose from the chair with the unhurried grace of the very old.
Well, Marlon, you look exactly the same. You always say that. It's always true.
Marlon came into the room, and he didn't look at Alaric. He looked at Lucy, and the look said, "Are you all right?" And her expression said, "Yes." And the entire exchange happened in under a second without a word. And Alaric watched it happen with something that might have been satisfaction.
She knows about May.
Alaric said. The room went quiet in a different way. Marlon stood very still, and Lucy watched the information move through him. Not shock, but something that had been prepared for and arrived anyway, with more weight than preparation accounts for. He looked at her. She looked back at him without flinching.
You had no right. I had every right. She's sitting in your apartment with your key and your tea, and your chair has already learned the shape of her. If that isn't the right, I don't know what is.
Marlon looked at Alaric with 2 centuries of complicated history in his face, and Alaric looked back with the serenity of someone who has made a decision and made peace with the consequences.
I'll leave you to it,
Alaric said. He picked up his coat from the arm of the chair. She hadn't noticed it there before. And he moved toward the door, and he stopped beside Marlon, and something passed between them, brief and wordless. The communication of people who have known each other across centuries and have developed a shorthand that doesn't need language. At the door, he looked back at Lucy.
He kept every letter she ever wrote him.
He said simply.
I thought you should know that too.
And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with that soft precision that seemed to be a characteristic of very old things. No excess force, nothing wasted. The apartment held them. Lucy, Marlon, the clock, the photograph, all that unsaid history rearranging itself in the space between them. He didn't move from where he was standing. She stayed on the sofa. And then she set her cup down and stood, and she crossed to him, and she stopped in front of him, close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes, and she said,
Tell me about her.
Something in him broke open. Not dramatically. It was not a dramatic man, and this was not a dramatic breaking, but quiet and structural, the way something breaks when the thing holding it together has finally served its purpose. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, they were darker than before, and he was looking at her with an expression that she understood now. Finally, fully, the expression of a person who has been in the dark for a very long time and is standing in the first light and doesn't quite trust it yet. He told her. They sat together on the sofa, closer than they had ever sat, his shoulder against hers, her feet tucked up under her in the way she always sat when she was in for the long conversation. And he told her about May, about Shanghai, about the turn of a century that felt like the whole world exhaling and inhaling at once. About a woman who had looked at him and seen what he was and stayed anyway, who had loved him with the particular fierceness of someone who knows from the beginning that the time is limited and decides it's worth it regardless. About watching her age while he didn't, the specific grief of that, the way love can exist in perfect parallel with loss. About the morning she died and the century and a half that came after. Lucy listened without interrupting. She listened the way he had listened to her 2 nights ago on the city street, without the performance of listening, without making it about herself, just being present with it, holding the weight of it without trying to put it down. When he finished, they were quiet for a long time.
You kept her letters,
she said.
Yes.
Where?
He looked at the bookshelf. At a particular section of it, the lowest shelf, where the books were oldest and most worn, and she looked and she saw, between 2 volumes, a small wooden box with a brass clasp that she had noticed before without registering it. She didn't ask to see them. That wasn't what this was.
I'm not her,
she said.
No.
I need you to know that you know that.
Lucy.
I'm not a replacement for something you lost. I'm not a second attempt. If that's what this is, then we should...
That's not what this is.
He turned to face her on the sofa, and his hand came up to her face. The same gesture as the first night, the same deliberateness, but different now. Fuller now, the thumb against her cheek, not wiping a tear, but simply there, present, tracing the line of her face with the care of someone learning something they intend to know for a very long time.
What this is,
he said,
is the first time in 140 years that I have sat in this room and not felt like the last person alive in it.
She looked at him. At this man who was 230 years old and had loved someone and lost her and carried it in a box on the lowest shelf for a century and a half and had still, eventually, opened a door on a corridor floor for a crying woman with divorce papers. She reached up and covered his hand with hers, where it rested against her cheek. And then she closed the remaining distance between them, and she kissed him. He went very still for the space of a breath. That particular stillness of his, but charged now, different, the stillness of something about to move, rather than something at rest. And then he kissed her back, and it was nothing like she expected and everything she should have known it would be. It was careful, and it was certain, and it was 2 centuries of learned restraint, and one very specific moment of letting go of it. And his hand moved from her cheek to her jaw, and his other hand found the back of her head, and she felt the full, unhurried attention of him like something physical, like light, like being the only thing in the room that mattered, and knowing it. When they finally separated, the city outside was fully dark, and the lamp threw its amber light across the room, and she was breathing differently than she had been, and he was looking at her with an expression that she thought she would spend a very long time learning to read and never entirely finish.
The cobertura,
she said, because she needed air and movement and the sky above her, because she was the kind of person who, when something enormous happened, needed to stand outside and let the world confirm that it was still there. He didn't ask why. He simply stood and offered his hand, and she took it, and they went up. The rooftop was quiet and cold and enormous with sky. The city spread out below them in every direction, lit and moving and entirely indifferent. And Lucy stood at the edge, with Marlon beside her and his hand still in hers, and the wind moving through her hair, and she looked at the city she had lived in for most of her adult life and saw it differently, saw it the way he must see it, as a thing that changes and continues, that loses things and builds over them, that is always in the process of becoming something else.
If I became like you,
she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It arrived the way the most important sentences sometimes arrive, not constructed but surfaced, rising from somewhere below the deliberate mind.
If I chose that, would you?
Don't.
The word was quiet and immediate.
Not tonight. That's not a question for tonight.
When?
When it's not new, when it's not…
He stopped, looked at the city, looked at her.
When you've had time to want your life, Lucy. Your human life. I watched someone choose to stay human because she wanted to grow old, and I honored it, and I would do it again. I will not be the reason you make a choice you can't unmake before you've had time to want what you'd be giving up.
She looked at him. This careful, ancient, ferocious, gentle man who had kissed her like she was the first real thing in a century and was already, before the night was out, thinking about what was best for her rather than what he wanted.
You're going to be very difficult to stop loving.
She said. He looked at her with those dark eyes and the city behind him and the wind moving through his long, black hair. And he said nothing, because he was Marlon, and Marlon didn't say things when the moment had already said them better. But his hand tightened around hers. And above the city, the sky was full of stars that had been burning for longer than either of them could calculate. And below them, the city continued its eternal process of losing things and building over them and becoming. Always something new. The boy was born on a Tuesday, in the blue hour before dawn, when the city was at its most honest. Marlon was there for all of it, which Lucy had not entirely expected, because there are things that 2 centuries of solitude do not prepare a person for, and the particular vulnerability of a delivery room is one of them. But he was there, his hand in hers through the long hours, his voice steady and close against her temple, saying things she wouldn't be able to fully recall afterward, but would remember the quality of, the sound of someone who has decided that this moment is the only moment that exists and is giving it everything. When the nurse placed Kai Jong Wilson into his arms for the first time, Marlon went very still. Not his usual stillness, not the composed, calibrated stillness of a man who has learned across centuries to hold himself carefully. This was different. This was the stillness of someone who has been, without warning, undone. He stood with the baby against his chest, and he looked down at this small and improbable person. Dark hair already, a remarkable amount of it, and a face that was doing the thing newborn faces do, cycling through expressions with the randomness of someone trying on emotions they don't have names for yet. And Lucy, exhausted and undone herself, watched her vampire husband hold their son and felt something shift in the architecture of everything she understood about love. It made more room. That was the thing she hadn't expected. She had loved Marlon with what she had believed was the full capacity of herself. And then Kai arrived and the capacity simply expanded, the way a room expands in a dream, without breaking, without announcement, just suddenly larger than it was.
He's so small,
Marlon said. His voice was different. She had learned every register of his voice across the years. The careful one, the warm one, the one he used when he was being deliberately unhelpful, the one he reserved for the moments when he let himself be fully present. But this one was new, unguarded in a way that even their most intimate moments hadn't quite reached. Stripped of all 230 years of learned composure, just a man holding his son for the first time, terrified and grateful, and completely without armor.
He'll get bigger,
Lucy said.
I know,
He stopped, looked up at her, and his eyes were bright in a way she had never seen them, and she understood that what she was witnessing was Marlon Zhang crying without quite crying, the tears held back by the same restraint that held everything back, but present, undeniably present in the brightness of his gaze.
I know,
she said softly. He looked back down at Kai, who had settled against his chest with the immediate and absolute trust of the very new, and Marlon held him with a care so precise it looked almost reverent, and Lucy thought, here is a man who has held himself apart from the world for 140 years, and look what he does when the world is small enough to hold. The years that followed were the fullest of her life. Not the easiest. A child is not easy, and a child with Marlon's particular genetic inheritance presented specific challenges that no parenting book had anticipated. Kai slept little and thought much. He was speaking in full sentences at 18 months, which the pediatrician attributed to an enriched home environment, and which Lucy and Marlon attributed to the fact that his father had been reading to him in Mandarin, English, and French since before he could hold his own head up. He was curious about everything and afraid of almost nothing, which was either a blessing or a harbinger, depending on the day. Marlon took to fatherhood with the same quality he brought to everything he decided to commit to, completely, without reservation, with the full force of 2 centuries of accumulated patience and attention turned toward this one small person. Lucy came home one afternoon when Kai was 3 to find them on the living room floor. Marlon cross-legged on the rug with a book open in his lap, and Kai pressed against his side, both of them looking at the pages with identical expressions of concentration, and Marlon was reading in Mandarin, his voice low and even, and Kai was following along with one small finger, tracing the characters with a seriousness that made Lucy stop in the doorway and press her hand over her mouth. She stood there for a full minute before either of them noticed her.
"Mama's home,"
Marlon said, without looking up from the page, because he had always known when she entered a room. Kai scrambled up from the floor with the particular full-body enthusiasm of a 3-year-old receiving good news, and Lucy caught him and held him and looked over his head at Marlon still on the floor with the book in his lap. And he looked back at her with that expression, the one she had first seen in a delivery room, the undone one, the one without armor. And she thought, I would sign those divorce papers 1,000 times if it meant ending up here. There was the night when Kai was 4 and had a nightmare. Something about a dog. The details were incoherent in the way that 4-year-old nightmare details always are. And Lucy was already moving toward his room when she heard Marlon's voice through the wall, low and steady, and she stopped. She stood in the hallway outside Kai's room and listened to Marlon sit with their son in the dark. And what she heard was not the performance of comfort, not the generic reassurances that adults offer children to end the inconvenience of nighttime distress, but a story. An actual story, told quietly, from memory, about a fox who lived in a forest so old it remembered when the mountains were young, and the fox's particular problem and how she solved it, and Marlon's voice in the dark had that quality she had loved from the first night, the quality of something that had no urgency. And she heard Kai's breathing slow and settle, and she heard the story continue past the point where the child needed it, because the man telling it was making sure, absolutely sure, before he stopped. She went back to bed and lay in the dark and felt the particular fullness of a life that has exceeded what you thought you were allowed to want. When Kai was 5, Marlon taught him to play chess. This was, Lucy felt, ambitious, but Marlon approached it with the same systematic patience he brought to everything, beginning not with the rules but with the pieces, their names, their histories, the way each one moved through the world according to its own nature. Kai, who had his father's capacity for sustained attention and his mother's impatience with anything that wasn't immediately interesting, lasted approximately 4 minutes on the first day and 45 on the 6th, and by the end of the month, he was beating Lucy consistently and giving Marlon something that was almost, though not quite, a challenge.
"He's going to be better than you,"
Lucy said one evening, watching them from the kitchen doorway.
"He already sees patterns I have to think about."
Marlon said with a pride so unguarded it made her laugh.
You're not even a little bit bothered by that.
"Why would I be? He's mine."
She looked at him across the room. Her husband, who was 230 years old and had a 5-year-old who was going to beat him at chess, sitting on the living room floor, looking at their son with an expression of pure, uncomplicated delight. And she thought, you spent 140 years in the dark, Marlon Zhang. Look at you now. The years kept moving, as years do, with the particular momentum of a life that is fully inhabited, quickly when looked back on, slowly enough in the living of it to feel real. Kai grew with the speed that children grow, which is to say, constantly and without warning, always arriving at the next version of himself before anyone had quite finished getting used to the current one. He had Marlon's dark hair and Lucy's eyes, which was a combination that stopped people on the street when he was a teenager, and that he was entirely unbothered by, having grown up in a household where extraordinary appearance was simply the baseline. He was quiet like his father, and curious like his mother, and funny like both of them, with a dry wit that had been emerging since approximately age 7 and had only sharpened since. He knew, by the time he was 12, what his father was. They had told him carefully, the three of them together on the couch one Sunday afternoon, and he had listened with his father's stillness and his mother's intensity, and then he had said, "So that's why you don't eat breakfast." Marlon had looked at Lucy, and Lucy had looked at Marlon, and then both of them had laughed, the sudden, unguarded kind, and Kai had looked moderately satisfied with this response. He asked questions, after many questions, across many months, in the way that Kai processed large things, slowly and thoroughly and from multiple angles. Marlon answered all of them with the same quality he brought to everything, completely, without condescension, treating his son's curiosity as the serious thing it was. Lucy would find them sometimes in the evenings, deep in conversation about things that ranged from the biochemistry of vampiric physiology to what Shanghai looked like in the early 20th century, to the ethical dimensions of a lifespan that outlasted everyone you loved, and she would stand in the doorway of her own life and feel almost unbearably grateful for all of it. Kai graduated on a bright Saturday in June, in a stadium full of families and the specific organized chaos of a university commencement, and Lucy sat in the stands with her program in her hands and her sunglasses on because she had been crying since they pulled into the parking lot and had no intention of stopping. Marlon sat beside her. He was not crying. Marlon almost never cried in the technical sense, but he had the brightness in his eyes that she had learned to read, the thing that happened when he felt something too large for his usual composure to fully contain. He was watching the procession of graduates with an attention so focused it was almost visible, scanning every face, and then Kai appeared in the line, tall, dark-haired, laughing at something the person beside him had said. And Marlon went still. Lucy reached over and put her hand over his. He turned to look at her, and his expression was the undone one, the delivery room one, the one without armor. And she looked back at him through her sunglasses with her wet eyes, and no words were necessary because they had been married for over 2 decades and had built a language between them that didn't always require words. And what passed between them in the stadium sunshine was simply, "Look at what we made. Look at what we did. Look at this person who exists because we found each other in a corridor." Kai, crossing the stage to receive his diploma, looked up into the stands at exactly the right moment. Or perhaps it wasn't exactly. Perhaps it was the particular awareness he had inherited from his father, the ability to locate the people who mattered in any space. And he found them, and he grinned. And Lucy burst into fresh tears, and Marlon raised one hand in a gesture that was minimal and precise, and said everything. That evening, after the celebration dinner, Clementine had come, and Kai's friends, and there had been excellent food and too much noise and the specific joy of a table that is too full. After everyone had gone home, and Kai had disappeared to meet friends, and Lucy and Marlon were alone in the apartment that had grown and changed over the years. The way apartments do when they're genuinely lived in, Lucy stood at the kitchen window and looked at the city and said,
"I think it's time."
Marlon was behind her. She heard him set down what he was holding.
Not because I'm afraid of getting older, not because I can't bear the idea of leaving you, though I can't. I want to be honest about that. But because I've lived, Marlon. I've had the full thing. The marriage that failed, and the corridor floor, and the coffee that you made and didn't drink, and the boy who is going to beat you at chess before he's 30.
He already beats me.
I know, I've lived all of it, and I want more of it, and I want it with you, and I think...
She turned from the window.
I think I'm ready.
He looked at her across the kitchen. This man she had known for over 2 decades, who was still and would always be exactly as he had been in a corridor doorway. The long black hair, the dark eyes, The face that had been carved by someone with specific ideas, but different now in all the ways that mattered. All the interior ways, filled up with Kai and chess and 3 languages and a fox story told in the dark and 20 years of her.
You're sure?
I've never been more sure of anything.
It will hurt.
I know.
And there's no...
Marlon.
He stopped.
I know, I've always known. Ask me again in another 20 years and the answer will be the same.
He crossed the kitchen and he took her face in both hands, the way he had learned to hold things he intended to keep. And he looked at her with those dark eyes that had 250 years in them now, and still, somehow, managed to look at her as if she were new.
Then we do it right.
He said.
With Kai here. With all of us.
She nodded. They called Kai. He came home that night and they sat together, the 3 of them, in the living room that had held chess games and bedtime stories and Sunday afternoons and all the ordinary architecture of a life built carefully between 2 impossible people, and they talked. Not about logistics. Those had been discussed across months, carefully, the way Marlon discussed everything that mattered. They talked about what it meant, about what she was choosing and what she was releasing and what she would carry forward. Kai listened with his father's stillness, and then he said, in the voice that had been deepening since he was 15 and now had something of Marlon's cadence in it. That unhurried quality, the one that didn't rush, that he had always known she would choose this. That he had watched her for 20 years, choosing the fullest version of everything, and this was simply the most complete version of that same choice. That he wasn't losing his mother, that you don't lose someone who is going to be there forever. Lucy held her son for a long time. Marlon stood nearby, his hand on Kai's shoulder, and the 3 of them were quiet together in the apartment. And outside, the city moved through its midnight routines, indifferent and continuous and entirely unaware that something irreversible and necessary was happening in apartment 4C. The transformation was nothing like the stories. It was quiet. It was intimate. It happened in the dark of their bedroom with Marlon beside her, and his voice the last human thing she heard clearly. Low, steady, saying her name the way he had always said it, with the particular weight of someone for whom a name is not a convenience, but a thing they mean. And there was pain. Yes, real and genuine pain. But underneath the pain was something else. Something that felt like a door opening rather than a door closing. The specific sensation of a threshold crossed in the direction you chose. She didn't lose herself. That had been her deepest fear. Not the pain, not the change, but the loss of the particular self that had signed divorce papers on a Tuesday evening and ended up on a corridor floor and accepted tea from a stranger who turned out to be 230 years old. She had been afraid that what came out the other side would be something other than Lucy. But she was Lucy. She was entirely, completely Lucy, just more. Just with the volume turned up on everything she had always been, the senses sharper, the awareness deeper. The capacity for both joy and grief expanded into something that had no ceiling she could locate. When she opened her eyes in the dark, Marlon was looking at her, and his expression was the one she had no name for, the one from the corridor, from the delivery room, from the stadium stands. And she understood now that it was simply love, expressed by a man who had learned across centuries to feel it carefully, and that careful love was not lesser love, but more precise love, love that knew exactly what it was doing.
Hello,
she said.
Hello,
he said. They went up to the roof as the night was ending. All 3 of them, Lucy and Marlon and Kai, who was 23, and tall and dark-haired, and had his mother's eyes and his father's stillness, and his own particular way of moving through the world that belonged entirely to neither of them, went up the stairs to the rooftop in the last hour of darkness, and they stood at the edge and looked at the city spread below them, all those lit windows, all those lives, all that continuous and indifferent human motion. The sky to the east was beginning. Just the suggestion of it, a lightening at the horizon, a shift in the quality of the dark from absolute to almost. The city's artificial light starting to compete with something older and more patient. Lucy felt it differently now. The light, the air, the particular smell of a city in early morning, exhaust and green, and something ancient underneath both. She felt it with a precision that made her laugh softly, involuntarily, the way you laugh when something is more beautiful than you were prepared for. Marlon looked at her.
Different?
Everything is different. Everything is...
She stopped, looked at the horizon.
I can hear the river.
You'll learn to filter it. It takes time.
How much time?
I'll be here while you figure it out.
Kai stood on her other side, his shoulder against hers, looking at the city he had grown up in with the expression of someone seeing it for the first time, from a new angle, which was, she supposed, exactly what was happening. He reached over without looking at her and took her hand. She held it. Her son's hand, warm and real. The hand that had been small enough to fit in her palm entirely, and was now larger than hers. The hand that had traced Mandarin characters in a book on a living room floor at age 3. She held it and felt the full weight of everything it contained. All those years, all those mornings, all those versions of him arriving one after another, too fast, the way children arrive at their next selves. And she thought, I get to keep this. I get to keep all of it, going forward. The sky continued to lighten. Marlon's hand found her other hand, and he held it with the same quality he had held everything she had given him, completely, without reservation, with the knowledge of someone who understands that some things are given once and should be held accordingly. The first true light came over the horizon with the slow, enormous certainty of something that has been doing this since before the city existed, before the country existed, before any human language had a word for morning. It spread across the sky in layers, deep blue first, then something between blue and gold, then gold itself, the real thing, the light that has no equivalent. Lucy watched it come. She had watched sunrises before. She had watched them from beds and rooftops and car windows and the terminals of early morning flights, and she had always found them beautiful in the abstract way that beautiful things are beautiful when you are not paying full attention. But this was different. This was the sunrise seen by someone with 2 centuries of patience ahead of her, and the particular precision of new senses and the hand of her husband in one hand, and the hand of her son in the other. And it was not abstract at all. It was the most specific thing she had ever seen.
Oh,
She said softly. Neither of them asked what she meant. They already knew. The light kept coming, the way light does, steadily, without drama, without asking permission, and the 3 of them stood on the rooftop of a building that had held all of them in various configurations across more than 2 decades, and they watched it together. And below them, the city that had witnessed a woman on a corridor floor and a man opening a door, and everything that came after continued its eternal business of being a city, losing things, and building over them and becoming, always, something new. Marlon turned to look at Lucy as the full morning light arrived. She turned to look at him. 250 years of solitude and 1 corridor floor and 1 cup of tea and 1 key left on a table and 1 rooftop and 1 boy who beat him at chess and 1 transformation chosen freely, completely, with both eyes open, all of it visible in his face in the morning light. Or maybe she was simply finally able to see it clearly, now that she had the eyes for it.
Still too much?
He asked.
always.
She said.
Isn't it wonderful?
He smiled. The real one, the one that arrived rarely and without announcement and changed the whole geometry of his face. The one she had been collecting since the first morning in his kitchen when she'd said something that surprised it out of him. The one that had no centuries in it, no composure, no careful restraint. Just Marlon, fully and completely Marlon, in the morning light on a rooftop with his family.
Yes,
He said.
it is.
Kai looked at both of them with the expression of someone who has grown up watching 2 people love each other and understands, having watched it up close for his entire life, exactly what it looks like when it's real. He said nothing. He didn't need to. He simply turned back to the sunrise, his mother's hand in his, and they all three stood together and watched the light make the world new. Which it does, every morning, without fail, regardless of what happened the night before. The light doesn't ask about your history. It simply arrives and illuminates, and leaves the seeing to you. And Lucy Wilson, who was no longer only Lucy Wilson, who was now something older and more patient and more luminous, who had once sat on a corridor floor with divorce papers in her bag and no particular plan for what came next, stood in the morning with her husband and her son and the whole of an unfinished future ahead of her, and she was not too much for any of it. She was exactly enough. She had always been exactly enough. It just took a door opening in the right corridor, at the right moment, for the world to finally confirm it. If this story found you at the right moment, if something in Lucy's journey felt familiar, if Marlon's particular kind of patience reminded you of something you're still waiting for, if Kai's hand in his mother's on that rooftop made you feel something you don't have a clean name for yet, then this story did exactly what it was made to do. Leave a comment below and tell us which moment stayed with you. Was it the corridor floor? The breakfast he didn't eat? The chess games? The sunrise? And if you're not subscribed yet, this is the moment. There are more stories coming, more impossible loves, more doors opening at exactly the right time, more people finding each other in the places they least expected to be found. Subscribe. Stay. You won't want to miss what comes next. What?